Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Katie, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our first alumni gathering for the course that we now call Leading Through Collapse. So when we started it, I had to talk about leadership and sustainability. It was in the university context. But there was always this deep adaptation aspect to it. And so we've just over time expanded that basically as people have become more aware of what's happening in the world and wanting to come and learn with Katie and me and other people with collapse awareness in mind. I'm probably going to, I'll talk for about 15 minutes, just some general reflections to help reconnect with some of the themes in the course and offer some thoughts with that context about what I think's been happening in the world and in the field of collapse awareness in the year since my book, Breaking Together, came out. I've got some notes, so I try and make the most use of this time as possible. So you may remember, depending on how long ago it was, the one thing we explored in our course together was the way our culture shapes our feelings, our thoughts, and actions, and of course, how that matters for a few reasons. If we want to be helpful to others or to the environment, or if we want to self-actualize or even self-transcend, then we need to become more aware of how much we're thinking culture's thoughts and feelings rather than just assuming they're our own. And if we want to liberate ourselves and each other, so we might better discover realities and possibilities together, then we need to be aware of the way we are enculturated. So you may remember, if you didn't know it anyway, that's the term for how culture shapes our sense of self, sense of other, sense of the world. So although the disruption and degradation of societies is sometimes blamed on bad politicians or mistakes or bad luck or the lack of a necessary technology to fix things, there's overwhelming evidence now that a widespread breaking of societies is due to the inherent assumptions, values, and structures of modern societies. So with that in mind, we might wish to become more aware of our enculturation so we don't repeat harmful patterns as situations continue to deteriorate around us. So the course that you participated in at some point in the last 5.5 years offered the view that habitual patterns of communication are serving dominant structures of power, which enable and oppress people in different ways, and that each and every one of us is continually participating in reproducing those structures of power. And to do that, we drew on sociology, cognitive linguistics, psychology, trying to shed some light on all of that. And we also practiced alternative ways of communicating together in person with authentic relating, and more deliberate ways of communicating in public, being aware of frames and narratives, where we're trying to seek to shift habitual patterns. And we argued that if the concept of leadership is pointing to anything useful, then it really involves helping people become more aware of assumptions so that they can work together for aims that they consider significant. Now, that doesn't mean that those aims are good, so I wouldn't necessarily therefore assume that that is good leadership. That's another conversation. But after some years in this field, one of my attempted acts of leadership is this book, Breaking Together, which came out a year ago today. It mainly contributes to our potential leadership on collapse risk and readiness by demonstrating how the process of societal collapse is already underway, that it's caused by unfair, exploitative systems of power, which are going to become more aggressive and oppressive over time. So we could choose to resist that while enabling ways every one of us coping locally and perhaps even flourishing differently in that context. So I'm pleased a year since publication, the book is feeding into relevant discussions and initiatives all around the world, which is what I hoped for. So with all that in mind, a year after my book came out and ahead of this alumni gathering, I took some time over the last few days to reflect on what I think is most important about what's happening in the world, and specifically in the collapse-aware field, if we call it that. I think it is a field now. And I want to look at each in turn. And of course, you know, although I live in Indonesia, I have a Western bias. So what I'll be talking about is entirely dependent on where my attention goes by someone who relies on English language media. So what's happening in the world? So I think the breaking of modern societies is now quite obviously underway. And I provide the evidence for that perspective in the first half of Breaking Together. The mass media and politicians invite us to think that a declining standard of living is to do with mistakes and can be corrected with the right policies, voting for someone different, for example. But instead, in the book, I show the data demonstrates actually it's happening in nearly all countries of the world and began before 2016. And in the book, I use a variety of data sets on things like education, life expectancy, malnutrition, chronic disease, mental health, to show this trajectory of societies around the world. And of course, now we even have eco-inflation or climeflation, where food's becoming more expensive because of environmental disruption to agriculture. So it's all happening now. And chapter 4 in my book on our health and biodiversity shows that how a world's becoming more diseased and therefore infecting us more, because obviously we're part of that world, we're not separate. But I also show that how some scientists recognize that risk of an era of pandemic and therefore started doing reckless research on how to combat that, making matters worse, arguably. So since March 2023, the world's climate also has gone particularly bonkers. Many of you will be paying attention to all that. It's quite scary. You know, average ocean temperatures leaping up and global average temperatures, air temperatures jumping about 0.5 degrees Celsius in about a year in the last 12 months. And that's something that took 500 years to occur before, according to, you know, the best estimates, the best analysis, reconstruction of ancient climates. So finally, the head of the relevant NASA Department on Climate, Gavin Schmidt, has admitted that none of this was predicted, at least not by them. But it's too scary for many to look at this, so some pretend still that technology will magically save us, and while others are now pretending it's all a hoax by a bunch of global bogeymen. So for me, when I see that, it hurts because I see it as a crumbling of what I call the cultural cement of society. And in chapter 7, I explain how that cement includes the basics like a belief in the fairness and legitimacy of banking and money systems, commerce, regulation, government, political parties, bureaucracies, the works. There's also a fracturing of the systems for our communication, our dialogue, and our collaboration. We're seeing the powerful weaponize something which we looked at in our course called moral psychology. They're weaponizing that to manipulate us to feel disgust towards people who have deviant opinions on important matters of public concern. And that is done because it serves to shame people into silence. Not just the people who speak out, but the people who watch the shaming and therefore think twice. So this authoritarianism and demonization during the first few years of the pandemic has created this horribly febrile atmosphere in our public sphere, and also now a lasting backlash against any expert warnings on collective risks and challenges, such as climate change. So it's a pretty bad situation. In both mass media and alternative media, at least in English, there's a lack of accessible commentary on the underlying drivers of the many problems or crises. And of course, those working for incumbent institutions don't want to critique systems of power in general. So instead, we're often told that there are a few bad apples, or perhaps maybe a a cabal of maggots in the apples who've got evil intent. We just need to get rid of them and we'll be fine. I think that's probably why there seems to be a lack at present of a widely held and coherent structural analysis and an associated political movement for our new era of collapse. And with these trends in view, I think the ideas in the course that you took suggest that convening people to become aware of the manipulations and to live differently to what's being pushed upon us seems more important than ever. And part of that is the development and articulation of a framing and a narrative for a solidarity-based politics for an era of disruption and collapse. And so that was my intention when writing this book. I wanted to contribute to that. Might not have all the answers, but I want to get that conversation going, if it wasn't already. So I just want to say a few things then about what's happening or not in the collapse-aware field. So despite it being taboo in many countries, especially Anglo-Saxon ones, I think awareness of the trajectory of breakdown is growing, both privately and even in the public utterances of leaders and in their initiatives. And I think that's partly due to the abrupt changes in climate since March 2023. But also because there's just been no reductions in emissions. Politics is not going in the right direction at all, even if we didn't have wars. And it's partly due to the increasing number of crises other than wars, so the pandemic, famine growing. So collapse is increasingly seen as a process that is underway rather than a one-off event at some point in the future. And that's something I explained in the book. And it surprised me quite a lot that it seems that people can accept that understanding of collapse as a process already underway. They can accept that more readily, despite that actually being even worse than what my conclusion was 6 years ago in the deep adaptation paper, that collapse was somehow in the future. Unfortunately, despite that awareness, collapse-readying actions seem very minor and disparate in most countries today. And explicitly deep adaptation-related parts of the broad collapse-aware field aren't growing as much as they might, with some notable exceptions like Hungary. Now, of course, I don't pay as much attention as I could, but that seems to be my impression. I mean, in Hungary, where I just came back, they have 20,000 people in their Facebook group, and it's always in the media. There are regular meetings, lots of initiatives being created. They're developing a program for teaching children basic skills. They're looking to grow more food locally. There's quite a lot happening. Perhaps it's happening in other countries and not branded DA, but in Hungary it's branded DA. And as I was saying, the mass media report on it fairly. And top professionals like rectors of universities are on their morning national radio programs talking about their belief that environmental change is now breaking modern societies and we can't stop it, we have to respond. But the lack of growth of DA communities elsewhere could be perhaps to do with shadow banning online since 2020, which I describe in chapter 13 of the book. I'd be interested, though, to hear of your ideas about maybe whether DA is not growing as much as it might in sort of serving the collapse-aware field, how to help people wake up to the core premise and the concept, the community, the movement of deep adaptation. I should also say that mainstream environmentalism seems still to be somewhat hostile to this perspective, which they call doomism, and many sort of Greens in power, top jobs, still, they're basically eco-modernists, and they're even beginning to express forms of authoritarianism. And I guess Germany is the extreme example where the Greens are in government. And sadly, they sound the most militaristic. They're most in favor of authoritarian action on public health issues. They're most in favor of cracking down on public protests against Germany enabling genocide in Palestine. So I think that needs to be a huge wake-up call for any of us who thought that the existing environmental movement or the environmental profession would naturally evolve into enabling a wise and compassionate response to societies experiencing disruption and breakdown. Just because we saw it coming doesn't mean will necessarily be that useful in the context of it happening. And meanwhile, the tentative steps by some environmentalists to focus on getting ready for breakdown could, sadly, be gazumped, overtaken by opportunistic and reactionary political movements. You know, in the UK, some of the founders of Extinction Rebellion have launched the Humanity Project, which is very deep adaptation-esque. It's about accepting that things are breaking and they want to get started in doing stuff locally. But in the UK, they're nothing compared to the emergence of the Reform Party, whose leaders now talking about, oh, climate change happening, we just need to adapt. So with these trends in mind and the insights from the course, one option for people interested in trying to soften the crash might be to even reduce focus on Western environmentalist organizations, environmental scholars and commentators, and instead make a choice to just work with those who are most affected by the current disruptions and difficulties, recognizing they're increasing locally and globally, and start from there. And we would naturally bring our environmental awareness to those kinds of collaboration, but it would be led by a wish to engage with people with the difficulties they're facing rather than sort of bring our sort of advocacy. With that in mind, I'm particularly interested in another co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Gail Bradbrook and colleagues who've gone off to create something called Prela and working in solidarity with anti-imperialists in Africa. And that's a real interesting shift because they think if we're going to see degrowth in the West, we need to help anti-imperialist movements in the global South. It's really interesting to see the evolution of thinking. Okay, some general reflections, because I've been reminded of the importance of leading through reframing and convening, as I thought over the last week. So that means not trying to provide the answers, but rejecting the unhelpful or false narratives and frames coming from who we might consider to be oppressive people, groups, and systems. But that leaves me with an open question about what the key leadership challenges for people are now, if living in Western countries in this new era of collapse. And by that, I mean, what activities could we undertake that would help far more people work together for aims they consider significant in this new era of disruption and collapse? I'm asking that question, I'm putting that to you all today, so less to try and inform my own efforts, just because I just think it's an important question to start asking, particularly in the context of what brought us together on the course. That's also partly because, you know, apart from some book promotion later this year, so the book's being translated into French and Spanish, and I will be launching it in Mexico and in France and Switzerland. Apart from a bit of that, and apart from continuing to do this course online twice a year and once or twice in person each year, I'm now sort of withdrawing from doing lots of research and advocacy. I've launched an organic farm school here in Indonesia, and I'm also wanting to give more time to music. I must say that's partly because I'm a bit exhausted with paying attention to how shit everything is. And what I love about the communities that are created around deep adaptation is that we recognize that that can happen and we can try and support each other to return to compassion, curiosity, respect. And at times that may mean we just need to take some time out. So that's sort of what I'm going to be allowing myself to do in the next few months before I then start on another rabble-rousing tour. So those were a few, hopefully those thoughts kind of reconnected you with the stuff that we talked about on the course, and maybe even resonated with some of the things you've been thinking over the last few years or months since whenever you took the course. And therefore that will stimulate as you go into the open space. So back to you, Katie.
Thanks, Jem. Yeah, I would say personal thanks as well. I know that you don't do this work for fun. Like, there is a personal toll that you bear yeah, I'm really appreciative of that you continue to show up. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now. We don't need